For Communities Overview and Scrutiny Committee meeting. I'd like to welcome all members, all officers, and at agenda item 6 today we have Lyndon Puddy from PSSU, Helen Swain from Torvine Women's Aid, Elkie Winton and Bethan Colville for the Housing and Supporting People officers. Yep, welcome. Please, members, if you could sign the attendance book, and I have had apologies from Brian Morby and from Barry Taylor and from Councillor Neil Waite. Are there any other apologies? Agenda item number 2, declarations of interest. Members, do you have any declarations of interest? If you do so, please declare them now. Okay. Item 3 on the agenda is the minutes of the meeting that was held on the 10th of December 2014. These minutes relate to the housing self-evaluation pilot that was scrutinised. If you could scan through them for accuracy, and I'd appreciate it if you have any comments. So, page 5, page 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 and 11. Do I have a proposer? Norma? Thank you. On the action sheet, I'm just going to ask members to note the actions. Agenda item 5 is the summary of key decisions made during the period 20th of March to the 26th of November. Members, I'm going to ask you again to note the decisions made by the relevant executive members during the period. Are there any concerns or questions? Okay. On to the main agenda item, supporting people, housing-related support services. I'm going to confirm that the purpose of the report is to inform members about the Council's Supporting People programme and commissioning intentions for 2015-2016. Paying particular attention to budget restrictions and the impact this will have on vulnerable service users. Members have been asked to review the local commissioning plan, which is attached, and the Council's approach to managing and administering the Supporting People programme grant, and also determine whether appropriate methodology has been put in place to mitigate impact on service users as a result of a reduction in grant funding. I'd now like to invite Elkie and Bethan to provide members with a brief outline of the key issues as within the report. So over to you, Elkie and Bethan.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the opportunity to present this report today. Obviously, members of this committee and others will be aware that there are cuts to the Supporting People programme. I'll briefly go through some of the sort of headline elements of the report. It's a joint effort between myself and Bethan, so we'll both chip in probably. Essentially, what we've presented to you today is a local commissioning plan. That's Appendix 1 to this report, which illustrates our commissioning intentions with the Supporting People programme grant funding for the next financial year. Just to remind members, and I know we've presented to the committee before, but just to remind members that we do really value the Supporting People programme in Torvine, as Welsh Government do as well. Essentially, it's a revenue funding stream, Supporting People programme grant, which currently, through a whole variety of different services and projects operate across Torvine. About 3,600 people will receive support at any one time, so it's quite a vast programme. There are a number of vulnerable client groups that are supported through the programme, and they're in point 4.3 of the report. I won't go through those, but essentially Welsh Government define the different vulnerable client groups, and it's a range of needs relating to, for example, people, men or women facing domestic abuse or experiencing domestic abuse, people with learning disabilities, older persons, young people, homeless people, people who may be care leavers, etc., etc. But the groups are actually defined in 4.3 of the report. Most importantly as well, I think what the programme of services do, and there are services that are provided by third sector organisations, some private sector organisations, the council, so a range of organisations and key sort of professionals delivering services. But there are obviously significant benefits because we all recognise that having a home is crucial to all of us, but it's also about, you know, the support to be able to maintain and set up a home and live as independently as possible. So through services, they play a big role in terms of not just ensuring that people have an appropriate home, but also in preventing homelessness, tenancy breakdown, antisocial behaviour, you know, unnecessary admissions into hospital or delayed discharges from hospital, you know, crime, people having social networks, people essentially being able to live their lives as happily and as independently as possible and feel part of a community. So that's sort of covered in 4.4. There has been recognition across Wales that the funding that Supporting People Programme Grant provides does actually generate some real savings in the wider public purse, and probably because of some of the points I just mentioned and how it reduces other issues, I suppose. But it's recognised that every £1.60 that's spent actually is probably a public saving of up to £3.41, so it really does make a difference on a wide range of portfolios. And I think it especially links to the new Minister's portfolio around communities, housing, tackling poverty. So I think that's sort of well recognised. However, as we know, we're in difficult times in the public sector, no different for Welsh Government, no different for the allocations that they pass down to local authorities. And whilst it's recognised the programme does a lot of good and the services and organisations, and I'm pleased to see we've got an excellent organisation with us today, actually there are still cuts to the programme, and that's been of significant concern to all of us and how we move forward. And essentially this report, obviously, and the local commissioning plan sort of tell on our intentions of how we take that forward. So 4.7, a budget back in sort of 2012, 13, 14, we were talking around about 3.6 million. It was indicated last calendar year that there were going to be 10% cuts to the programme across Wales. Obviously, that's a significant amount of money. What has happened, we've now received notification and an indicative budget for Torfaen and most of the Gwent authorities that the actual indicative cut for next year is about 5.45%, whereas some authorities in Wales have got a slightly higher cut. And that links to how the money is distributed across Wales and an allocation formula, and there is some recognition that the Gwent authorities, through a new distribution formula, don't get as much funding as some of the other authorities. So that's a bit of a positive, but it's still a cut. So that cut to us for next year, although it's still indicated by Welsh Government, we haven't had our final notification, we're looking at about £200,000 worth of savings. So it's better than the £360,000 we were potentially looking at. We're looking now at £200,000. Still a bit significant concern for us and still some impact there. Some time ago, there's a very good regional network and Wales-wide network around supporting people. The Gwent managers, Bethan and the other 4 local authority managers meet on a regular basis. There's a Gwent provider forum that meet regularly. There's also a regional collaborative committee that I chair, which oversees the funding arrangements on a regional basis. And a lot of discussion has been had with providers over the last couple of years, to be honest, because we knew cuts were coming, around how we can actually look at trying to sustain the programme and ensure that service users still receive services. So there was some agreement some time ago that we weren't going to adopt a salami slicing approach to the programme and just sort of apply a percentage rate to all services, which obviously would have greater impact on some services and organisations than others. 3 key sort of principles were adopted by Torfaen, and this was very much with our partners and providers as well, that we should consider what our local strategic priorities are, what the needs and demands are coming through. We should make sure that if there were any savings from organisations that are already existing, it would be appropriately evaluated through the review of services. And we also identified that there are some projects, some smaller projects, that have only been up and running for a short length of time, with an end date already planned in, so there could be a focus around that as well. So that was agreed by our local planning group, which operates, which we have providers who sit on that group, which Helen from Torfaen Women's Aid is one of our provider organisations, representatives, and it was also agreed by the Regional Collaborative Committee, which is a very formal, again, the same as the local planning group, it's a very formal terms of reference, and that approach was agreed. So I think it's worth bearing in mind that that's the sort of principles we've adopted. As such, the commissioning plan goes through a lot of consultation in terms of planning and evidencing the needs for services. There's a very robust framework for supporting people around looking at the needs of services, looking at the supply for services, consultation with service users, consultation with providers, consultations with key stakeholders to the programme, including members in the council and obviously committee. So there is quite a robust evidence of need for services. That's not to say there isn't any gaps, because there is. Services have waiting lists, some longer than others. But there is a framework that is very much well developed to sort of understand what the needs and supply are. So following that provisional approach, consultation with provider organisations and others, 7.5 highlights where services and efficiency savings are being met to basically make up that £200,000 savings for next year. It's really important to note that the Support and People team operate, if there is any service changes or decommissioning of services, they actually operate a decommissioning impact assessment, which very much focuses on any impacts to the service users already receiving services, but also focuses on how that affects the organisation as well and their sustainability. So the bullet points in 7.5 are the services that are either there's only one service that's actually being decommissioned, and the other services, or projects I should say, are pilot projects that were ending anyway, or slightly reduced funding. And there may be some questions around those after. Most importantly, part of that impact assessment, the first project or service is a very small service, the Learning Disability Supported Living Service. The individuals receiving that service already are in receipt of packages of care through our social care partners. They will continue to do so, and conversations have been had with the provider and the social care colleagues, and that package of care will continue, and there will be no impact really on the service users themselves. And when I say that, the care provider is already providing the care, and they were also providing an element of support, so it's the same workers. So whilst it's a very small funded service, so there's very minimal impact. So I need to point that one out. The second, third, fourth and fifth bullet point, the pilot projects that were initially set up when on a short-term basis that were scheduled to end this financial year. The organisations that are providing those services are already funded through the Support and People programme to a greater level with other services and projects. So conversations have been had with those organisations. Some of the organisations have actually offered those pilots and said, well, we recognise they were ending, we will be happy, to take this sort of cut into the next financial year. So those are ending, and they were always scheduled to do so. The reduction in funding, the three items at the bottom, those were Those are services where they're still going to continue. It's basically just a slight reduction in funding. It very much links to the structure of the organisations, the salary scales of the individual workers, because there'll be a worker in each one that is providing that service. It's more about right-sizing the cost to the actual support workers project provided, and there have been some changes in staff. So the staff will still remain. So the service users will still receive services. It's important to note that the reduction in funding of services and the pilot projects are very much services that where people pass through because they're floating support. So somebody will receive, they'll maybe in some crisis, they may be vulnerable for some reason, they'll receive some support for a period of time and then it floats off to someone else when their support needs have been met. So that will end naturally anyway. And then the service providers will not take on new referrals into that specific piece of service. So it's managed that way, so there shouldn't be any impact on service users, although technically it means there'll be less people being able to be supported at any one time. It'll be the new people that will go to other services instead, if that makes any sense. Quite difficult to explain. Item 8, obviously, point 8, sorry. Lots of consultation, as I've already mentioned. The local commissioning plan, Bethan took that to the exec member, Gwenaira Clark, obviously, for housing planning and public protection. So she's aware broadly of the local commissioning plan and its progress. I won't go through the implications in relation to policy, legal, finance, etc. Obviously, there are implications to a degree, but we're trying to manage and mitigate any negative impact as much as we can. Some other key points to mention, I suppose. I know we recently had the Homes Wales Act Members Policy Seminar. There are implications for housing services and supporting people services in the future coming into the next financial year. We know about the Homes Wales Act and the increased responsibilities around homelessness and homelessness prevention. Supporting people services very much play a role in that. We know that we've got the Gender-Based Violence, Domestic Abuse and Sexual Violence Wales Bill. There's implications for us there, and obviously the organisations and providers that we work with. So we're very much behind that, and we know that there is going to be changes coming into the future that will have an impact on the programme. Monitoring and evaluation. The Supporting People programme grant is obviously Welsh Government funded and is very much as a recipient of those funds as a local authority. There are quite lengthy terms and conditions, so there is quite a good and explicit regulatory framework that we have to adopt. The team very much monitor and evaluate services on a quarterly, annual basis. There's an outcomes framework that is now compulsory and has been for a number of years, which we've put a flavour of those outcomes in the table. In the table in 12.1. So basically, we try and adopt a very planned approach to the cuts. We very much work very closely with partner organisations, providers, and a big part of when we review services and engage with providers is actually talking to service users and asking them about the outcomes that they've achieved through the support provision that they've had in whatever setting. So Appendix 2 is the Supporting People strategy, which was developed a couple of years ago, which is very much provides a flavour of what the programme does, and it does give example case studies of how people's needs are met through the programme. And that's something we still adopt until it ends in 2017. Appendix 3, as I said previously, we were originally indicated a budget that was the same as this year, and the local commissioning plan adopts that indicative budget. The Appendix 3 is actually the spend plan for next year, which takes account of the cuts. We still haven't had our budget announcement. We have to work to this as per Welsh Government indications. We can't, halfway through the year, next year, suddenly start to deal with cuts. We're hoping that we'll get notice from Welsh Government within this financial year of what the actual final budget is. But in the past, sometimes it's been as late as June. So we can't work on the basis of waiting until then. So that's why there's two financial sets of figures, because it is a bit, we're in a bit of status quo at the moment. In a bit of limbo. So I think that's enough from me. If Bethan wants to add anything.
No, just that we've obviously tried to plan, as Arca said, as much as possible and consult with as many people, providers, service users, as we can really, to make sure that the cuts are applied in the best way possible, with ensuring the least disruption to the vulnerable people within Torfaen. So just any questions that anybody...
Thank you, Bethan, and I'm sure the members here today share my sentiments that it's an excellent report, and you've had a very tough task to make cuts which are vulnerable people, and it is difficult. And it was interesting to see and to hear how you actually how many meetings and how many different walks of life have been involved in the decision making to manage the funds in the year ahead, and it was excellent. And obviously now I hope you can stay with us, because I'm sure all my members are geared up now, ready to ask a few questions. I'm going to start with Councillor Parish. Councillor Parish.
Thank you, Chairman. You have gone through this actually, but if there's something you'd like to add, how are the cuts derived as set out in 7.5?
Obviously, Elka touched on this when she went through the report, that we looked very much regionally initially and agreed our approach across Gwent as supporting people teams. We agreed that we would look at our strategic priorities locally, that we would look at pilot projects that were already due to come to an end, and that we would consider things on a local level, and that we would all take the same approach. More locally then, we very much looked and consulted with providers. They were very clear about the level of cuts that we were potentially looking at. And we were, as Alka said, approached by some providers who felt that there was capacity within their existing provision to offer up those pilot projects, whilst being able to maintain the same level of support within existing provision. We looked at the level of utilisation within some of those pilot projects, and where they weren't fully being utilised, we held discussions with the providers about how better that support could be offered within existing provision, and we were able to reduce the pilot projects there. As far as the cuts to certain funding for pilot projects, I think Alka touched on the fact that there had been some staff changes as well, so we were able to right-size salaries where some members of staff might be on a higher grade, and we were able to bring those salaries down because there were newer member of staff in post, and that the salaries being offered within those pilot projects were more appropriate, without affecting the delivery of the service. So those pilot projects were able to continue.
Just to add to some of the pilot projects, when we set up a pilot, sometimes there's some front-end costs, such as recruitment and some elements
training
that we factor in earlier on in a pilot and lead-in periods. So sometimes the funding that we put into a service earlier on can actually reduce once things are set up. So it's important to note that as well.
Carrying on from picking up, before I asked the question I was going to ask, picking up on what Norma has put across, one of the biggest costs that you have are obviously buildings, rental buildings and whatever for some of your providers and their staff. Do you reward the providers who actually can come up with cuts internally amongst themselves and are seen to make concerted efforts to work smarter, in other words?
Through our consultation with providers, that's certainly an approach that we've encouraged. Wherever they can make cuts to the overheads, the management costs, they know what we're looking at in the way of cuts. So we've certainly encouraged that as an approach by our providers, and many of them have tried to make savings in that area. And I think that's an approach that we're going to have to try and adopt more long term as well, if further cuts, as we expect, come over the next 2-3 years.
Thank you. My question is to do with 4.5, which is, I was very interested in that statement, but for a neutral looking in, I'll read the statement for the benefit of everybody. It says for every £1.60 spend on supporting people's services, the saving for the public purse is £3.41. There's not many businesses that you can say that if you throw more money at it, you actually save more. My perception of it, without knowing the facts, is I would say that by teaching people to look after themselves and not go back into the downward spiral of drugs, the violence or abuse, which obviously incurs police involvement, etc., etc., that is where these savings are made. Is there anything that you'd like to add and sort of enlighten the panel where these savings actually come from, if there's anything else that I've missed there?
Absolutely. Thank you, Chair. I agree entirely. We have done lots of work over the years in terms of trying to evidence where, the health benefits, the poverty benefits, the whole host of criminal justice benefits, etc., of the programme. And we continue to do so. And certainly as a region across Gwent, and I think Torfaen leads this very well, we've done a number of pieces of work, and in fact we engaged with Welsh Government recently, and I think we sent it round to members as well, where we did a sort of a case study around a Torfaen family or an individual called Richard, and the difference of when Richard received support and when he didn't receive the support, and we actually costed up the various elements, whether it was an eviction costs, prison costs, health costs, etc. So we will continue to campaign on that front, and I think that piece of work is actually on the Welsh Government website, and it's been seen as a good piece of work, and we'll continue to do that across. And I think because the programme is so broad, it might be somebody with substance misuse, or it may be someone who's got limited, physical disability or limited access or mobility issues that we link in as well. So,
just staying on that subject. With these costs, and you've evidenced it with the House Proud campaign, Shelter, excuse my pronunciation, Housemark, CLG and that, we all live on these monetary graphs and things, and there's with figures and we're on stats. And basically, my argument is, if it's £1.63 spend, and the saving is X amount, and you've put that down, there comes a point, and the cuts are quite significant over the last 3 years, that if you add those reductions, they're nowhere near what you have to cut at 4.54% over the next year and over the coming years. That is £200,000. Now, this £1.63, at what point does it become a reversal? In other words, the costs are actually, or what money you're putting in is, say, goes down to 80p per person, and then it starts costing us more from the public purse. I wonder what stage and how far they can cut you before that happens. At the moment, can you guarantee over the next year or two, with these cuts that you envisage and that have been forecast, that you will continue to make some kind of saving? But there is a point, I'm sure it will come, whereby it does cost us more, and we need to keep and support these projects.
Just to make the point, I think that a lot of the services that we commission and a lot of our providers, the work that they do is very preventative and it's ongoing, and some of the savings will be seen in years and years and years to come, with the impact that the potential support going in for a woman who's experiencing domestic abuse. The benefits will be seen when her children are growing up. So some of these benefits will be seen, far further, absolutely, than next year or the year after. This will be ongoing.
Thank you. In regarding the discussion that was just taking place, if we can turn to 9.1.9, the crime and disorder. The last sentence is, cuts to the programme could result in increased crime and disorder. Even though you are saving money, do you envisage that with the projects which are going to be cut, that could increase the crime and disorder? if you like.
I think hopefully with the projects that we've had to look to reduce this time in this round of cuts, that's very much a statement that we don't know long term, obviously, what the further cuts are going to mean for us in Torfaen, and we have to assume that huge cuts could impact on the level of support that vulnerable people, people who are at risk of becoming engaged in crime and disorder, could have an impact on them and the level of support they're getting to pull them away from that lifestyle.
Just to add, Councillor Kemp, the outcomes indicators, 2 of them are very clearly around people feeling safe, and that actually those who maybe, but also that people are actually contributing to the safety and well-being of others as well. And I think you're right. I think, cuts, although we can manage them and mitigate them as best as possible, year-on-year cuts are likely to have an impact. And it's likely that, we may not be able to reduce and help and support as many people in the longer term, and we fully appreciate that, and we're trying to mitigate and manage the cuts as best as we can. But yes, ultimately, cuts on cuts is going to have an impact.
That's a priority in regarding the crime and disorder against the projects in which we fund, if you like, and support, is potentially the high-risk projects of increased crime and disorder. Do they take a priority need against lesser risks?
All the services that we have may do some work around reducing antisocial behaviour or helping people feel safe. And that's why there's some outcomes indicators that all projects can link in with. We do also have some very specialist type services and projects that are dedicated to, for example, to MAPA cases where people may be leaving prison, that we've got a dedicated support service that actually works across Gwent. And works with colleagues, obviously police, probation, in supporting individuals back into the communities and helping them manage behaviours, etc. We've also got another service that's dedicated to, for example, former ex-offenders. So within the local commissioning plan for next year, we haven't cut any of those services. So there are very specialist services, but that's not to say all services will be providing support to maybe some other sort of behaviours that challenge or whatever. So it's part of the programme across the brief, but it's also dedicated stuff, and that's not been taken out from the next year's commissioning plan.
Thank you. Sorry, still going back to 4.5, it would seem when you read that, it's absolutely counterproductive. If spending a bit more would save us more, well, it would seem at first glance that's the obvious thing to do. It seems we're cutting where really we can't afford to cut. The one thing I wasn't quite clear, when you say the saving for the public purse is that amount, is that the saving for the public purse including the costs of courts? So it isn't quite just as stark as saying if Torfaen were to spend more, Torfaen would save more. That's what I was trying to write. That does clarify it a bit, yeah.
It's an academic piece of work that have been undertaken a few times by various organisations, and it might be that if somebody receives support, that they weren't admitted to hospital, for example, there would be a health cost, or mental health, or other services, as well as housing, courts and benefits and other elements.
I was going to ask for you to elaborate on the methodology, having read the report, but you did cover that, and it was interesting to hear how you did that, whereby you were obviously consulted with your service providers, and you broke it down to 3 main areas, which was your local priorities, from what I gathered, savings that could be made with evaluations that were ongoing, and obviously cutting back on the pilot schemes. And I am satisfied. I was concerned with the pilot schemes, but again, they're usually they're the first to go, aren't they? Last in, first out sort of thing. But what I am interested in the methodology is the end bit, whereby a group of people get together and make those final decisions, and how many people and who was involved in that, and it must have been a long, hard debate sometimes, people defending their corners. Were the service providers actually out of the room at that time, or is it you've got all the information? I'm just interested.
Just to go back on some of the planning framework, for example, the team operate an annual planning day where service users come in, providers come in, and all the client groups, and there's an opportunity to feed back and actually voice what priorities are for people, what people need and want, and that's ongoing. In terms of final decision making, it's not made by the local authority officers, it's made by the Support and People Local Planning Group. We've, as per the terms of reference, the big grant terms of reference that Welsh Government provide us, that we have to adhere to, and we do adhere to, there is quite a rigid governance framework. So similar as there's a committee here today, we have local planning groups with explicit terms of reference, where we have provider representatives on, and Helen Swain from Solvang Women's Aid is a provider representative. We also have a regional collaborative committee, and the local commissioning plans have to be reported in one regional commissioning plan to the regional collaborative committee, which has got landlord representation, providers again, etc., Welsh Government and others, and that has to be signed off there as well, and has to be signed off by that collaborative group before we are awarded any grant. So there's quite a robust governance framework in place. For me, it's key that the service users are part of the consultation. It is a difficult conversation to have with clients and service users because the whole programme itself is very broad, but everybody will know about the service they receive or maybe have not received and would have benefited from. So that's an ongoing, always ongoing programme really. But what providers bring to the table is they're expert in the field and they'll know what clients and service users need and want. So we also rely very much on our providers and other stakeholders as well.
Thank you. I just needed reassurance. I knew that it wasn't taken lightly, any of these decisions, but I didn't realise how robust and the process was. But I'm really pleased. Councillor Parish.
Thank you, Chairman. Can you tell me, will there be any impact upon vulnerable service users? And how have you or will you ensure that the reductions in service delivery will have minimal impact?
Obviously, £200,000 is a substantial cut. I think our methodology and our reasoning throughout the whole process of trying to manage those cuts and implement them has been to minimise the impact on vulnerable people. I think, as Elka mentioned earlier, cut on cut on cut, unfortunately, is going to start having an impact. But we will continue to do our best to work with providers of services to try and remodel services where possible and ensure that existing delivery, that the impact on that is minimised as much as possible. I think ultimately, though, if cuts continue, then there is going to be an impact, but we will work as much as possible with other providers and other SP teams across Gwent and Wales, other organisations and government organisations to ensure that that's minimised as much as possible.
In regarding what you said there, at the moment we're just looking at a local level, if like. Have you thought about doing more regional work in regarding the areas in which you are likely to cut?
That's absolutely one of the areas that we're looking at and expanding on, and we've been asked by our RCC and by Welsh Government to look at more collaborative and regional ways of working. Last year we piloted some schemes regionally. There are obviously efficiencies and cost savings to be had then, and that's definitely a way that we're moving forward with our other colleagues across Gwent in SP teams, is to try and regionalise some schemes wherever possible. Sometimes that's not appropriate and you need to maintain that local level of support, but yeah, we do try and work as regionally and collaboratively with our colleagues as well, and that's something we're going to increase, because there are efficiencies to be had in providing that type of support.
Just to add, I think from a local perspective, we try and make sure that we don't make any decisions in isolation of certainly of Gwent, because we have got regional services where they actually work on a regional basis, and we may have a host authority who manages the contract or whatever. So we've for example, refuge provision, where it may not be appropriate to accommodate somebody fleeing domestic abuse within your own county. We would make sure that there were arrangements with our partner organisations and local authorities that we've got those sort of arrangements in place. So any decision we make these days that we haven't considered a wider region is not prudent, is it? So we very much have, and I think the Gwent SP teams are very well developed in working closely together, and also the regional commissioning plan that gets signed off by the Regional Collaborative Committee ensures that we keep that regional focus as well, and we're not making any sort of changes that don't account for other authority areas as well.
Let me take the next one. Thank you. Back to 7.5 again. You said that you were employing people on a lower rate, you know, because of they'd be junior sort of in the job. But did you have to make anybody jobless then? Did you have to, you know, sever anybody's employment whilst you were doing this?
No.
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 None at all.
No.
That's very good to hear.
Just to pick up on that point, mind, I know you're not in a position to actually make one of the service providers jobbers, but have they had to make any cuts in their manpower and or resorted to job sharing, and somebody's had to fall on their sword to enable to keep the service provider going? Because this is the day when one of the, as I said, alluded to earlier, personnel are one of your highest overheads. So are you aware that they've made any cuts?
At the moment, we're not aware of any specific staffing cuts that have taken place as a result of the cuts that we've implemented to the providers. I think very much the conversations that we've had with those providers, they are trying to ensure that that level of support is maintained in other ways, and to absorb it as much as possible. That's not to say that, you know, future cuts are obviously, that there's only so much that they can continue to do with the existing funding that they're getting, and, you know, obviously that could have an impact then on staffing levels.
My question is to do with, will there be any alternative provision available to service users who may experience discontinuation of services? And you've already explained that the learning difficulties are going to be covered by social care. So I'm very relieved to hear that. And that was the only one of that list that was actually discontinued. Is there anything else in the pipeline that might fall into that category that you foresee?
Obviously, we continue with our programme of monitoring and reviews, and that's something that's ongoing every year. I think moving forward, if there's further cuts, then, as I said sort of previously, you know, we'd have to kind of assess at the time how what kind of impact that would have. The cuts that we've made to pilot projects, we've done our best to ensure that support can be picked up within their existing service, and I think the providers are really committed to try and do that as well. So hopefully at this point that level of support and level of service to the individuals can be maintained, but in a different way.
I was also, I think it's important, because I know you guys can take things for granted and the information is important to us, but at 4.3, you listed client groups, and, I don't know whether that was in priority, I wouldn't have thought so, but it's just a list. But for me, you've got the top of the list is the women and men experiencing domestic abuse, and I know that that's been quite high profile with the last Chief Commissioner of Police. That was her portfolio. And it was, Gwent was quite high profile throughout the UK for that. And the guys on the coalface at Women's Aid and Havant Cymru and that are all doing sterling work. However, what people don't appreciate, in my opinion, is that the domestic abuse actually covers some of the other areas whereby their service providers are dealing with drug abuse, and they're actually solving a few of these problems, under one umbrella. And I just wanted, that to be noted.
On that point, I think it's sort of a good point to note that although we've had to look at reductions in some services, we recognise where there is increased need, and we're still trying to commission new services and new ways of supporting people to meet that need. We've recently commissioned and continued a complex needs worker post with one of our domestic abuse providers, because we recognise that actually people experiencing domestic abuse are coming through with all sorts of other issues, like alcohol issues, like drug misuse issues, mental health issues. So we've recognised that there's maybe a gap in delivery there, and we've attempted to plug that with a new service.
In regarding keeping on the domestic abuse, in Gwent and certainly Torfaen, there's a high support for women as such. Is there as much support for men, knowing that it's also coming out in the emerging themes in pages 45 and again and 47. It's just highlighted women experiencing domestic abuse and not men, if you like. And so can you expand on the support, especially in regarding housing, when it comes to men who are suffering domestic abuse?
This is an area that we recognised we needed to look at, and we did pilot four gender-neutral units of support around this. Actually, they weren't fully utilised, and it's one of the pilots that we've met with the provider around and agreed that actually the number of men that were coming through for support, because they're much harder to engage, and we know we need to do more work to try and promote that, and we're working with the provider to do that. They felt, and we agreed, that actually they can support the level of demand at the moment within existing provision. But that's not to say that, we're not continuing to look at that and react accordingly. But yeah, we did have a pilot project. It is one of the ones that we're discontinuing, but we're discontinuing it because the provider has said that they're able to continue to support the utilisation rates of that within existing provision. Does that make sense? Yeah.
It's just the one thing that I think it is a particular problem, and it's people who do have problems with every service going. The learning disabilities supported service, it says it's being decommissioned. How confident are you that there is, that social services, for instance, how strapped they are, that they can actually take up that challenge?
That service, a supported living service, the clients within the service had, through the service review, it was recognised they had no support needs. They already had higher care needs and are already receiving a 24/7, if you like, package of care. Quite often, if somebody has care needs, their support needs sometimes reduce. For example, understanding a tenancy agreement, having capacity to understand a tenancy agreement, and to basically live it more independently sometimes is limited or reduced. And I think this particular service, the clients that were in there were rightly receiving full-time packages of care. That care, registered care provider was also funded by Supporting People Programme grant to provide an element of support, and there were no support needs in or housing-related support. So conversations, obviously, we're a joint service area, we're a joint senior management team. We've had conversations with social care colleagues, the learning disabilities manager, the group manager, and the head of service, and it was just absolute common sense. It'll still be the same staff. And the people within the service, there was no real need for housing-related support, and they were already receiving community care funded, social care. So it's a very small, it was a smallish amount of funding and a small service. It wasn't, so that will continue. And social care colleagues were more than fine with that.
So you are really saying it was just you were kind of duplicating what was being done for them anyway, unnecessarily. Great.
Thank you. This question is about reducing funding to the Financial Inclusion Service when demand appears to be high for people wanting to manage their finances, as illustrated within the local commissioning plan.
Okay, that's absolutely relates to the point I made earlier that a member of staff has moved on to another job. They had been in post a long time, were on a much higher grade. Also, that's a service that when it was set up, there was accreditation that needed to be obtained by the staff around financial qualifications to enable them to support individuals with quite complex financial issues. There's a cost implication to that. Obviously, once that accreditation is received, it's just maintained and the costs go down, the management costs go down. So it is just a right sizing really of where that service needs to be funding wise now, now that it's set up and established. Yeah. Certainly nobody's salary has been reduced or there's no jobs that are going to be reduced from that.
I still have the floor. This one is a bit complicated to me. What are the main reasons for decrease in percentage for outcomes achieved for service users throughout October 2013 to March 14 in comparison to April to September 2013, as illustrated within the local commission plan? Is it because the numbers have gone up and the percentage is lower because the numbers are higher?
It could very much be that the figures you're looking at in that time period are people that could have been supported over a number of months and are actually at a higher point in achieving their goals. They could be at a 4 or 5, and there might have been an end in support for a lot of people, and then a lot of new service users entered those services, so they would be at a lower outcome measure. It's as simple as that. It's throughput of people. And also the time of year can sometimes have an implication on it. We do find sometimes that around Christmas, people tend to withdraw a little bit and focus on the, enjoying Christmas, and then they will maybe sort of come back to the issues within their lives after that. So that it can be sort of peaks and troughs really around the level of support and demand that's out there.
To go to the next one as well. What targets have been set for each of the outcomes as illustrated on the back of page 2 within the local... Oh, did I ask that? No. So this is a different one, isn't it? Yes. I'm getting confused with my questions. What targets have been set for each of the outcomes as illustrated on the back of page 2 within the local commission plan?
Which page on the...
Back of page 2 of the commission plan.
The outcomes, the 2 6-monthly...
Which one is it?
The target is based on around 40%. It is quite difficult to sort of set a target and measure because obviously we're talking about people and individual sort of levels of achievement through goals, which can vary. And then we set the intervention then, the target is set at 50, we set the intervention at 40. Again, it's quite difficult to come up with a percentage or a number because you're talking about, at what figure would we intervene, but actually, there might just be at that collection point, because it's a snapshot in time, a number of, like I explained, new service users coming into service receiving support. So they would be at a lower level. Does that make sense? It's quite...
If I add to that as well, the outcomes indicators are fed back to the support worker from the client being supported. So, and it's a sort of a joint conversation. So if I were being supported and I were feeling safer through whatever support I'm receiving, I would score on a 1 to 5. So it's always about somebody's own feelings. And through the support, what we're hoping for is that somebody is doing as best as they possibly can. Now, for everybody, that's very different. So, for example, if somebody's support was around managing being mentally healthy, if with the support in that individual through the services and they feel great and they're on a 5, but sometimes you can give as much support as you want and it'll stop them being on a 1, but it'll bring them to a 3. I know there is a science to people's feelings, and it's and some services, for example, if it's a person, say, who has learning disabilities, they may never be fully independent, and they may receive a service for years, but at least they're not down at number 1, they're on a 3. It's like comparing apples with pears, and how do you target what's good or what isn't? So it just sort of helps provide a story, and it's really important because it helps demonstrate how services do achieve things. But I think sometimes we focus on only the ones that are fully achieved, and there will be some people who will go up and down or will never fully achieve. So it's difficult.
Sorry, I'm keeping on chipping in when you're halfway through. With this, I notice it is the winter months that do you generally find, we hear about this SAD and whatever, do you generally find that people do have more problems through the winter?
I think, and Lyndon would probably back me on this one as well, is things like, for example, through homelessness often dips prior to Christmas, and as Bethan had said earlier, people are preparing and there's more positive things to look forward, goodwill. Certainly January, February, I think, and we all feel it, don't we? Sunny day and you feel better. We get certainly from things like financial inclusion. We know that sort of the end of January, people hit significant financial difficulties, which in turn creates household arguments, which in turn impacts mental health. So all of those triggers and issues certainly, January, February, I think. We also know, for example, school holidays, sort of the August period, there may be increase in antisocial behaviour or crime, and we don't want to draw too much from that, but there are sort of seasonal peaks and troughs, I think, depending on, individuals' sort of circumstances.
I've been also told is that there's, in regarding the DOV, the domestic violence around international days and rugby days, and Valentine days, that has implications into domestic violence.
Absolutely. If people are drinking, for example, there may be other triggers. Yeah, absolutely. It's difficult to, determine exactly why and where, but there are certainly peaks and troughs.
I'm quite interested in this table on, it's on page 43 of our pack, which is a summary of conclusions. It's just one page of table. I'll just hold it up there. And it's actually interpreting the data as a neutral looking in. And I wondered if you'd give me some help, because I was quite interested. A lot of the problems that we have, or these groups face, I presume, and forgive my ignorance, a lot of it is down to alcohol. alcohol is one key factor, certainly in domestic abuse, and you just talked about it now. And then I looked down all these client groups, and I looked down at number 5, which is people with alcohol issues. And I'd like to go, I can pretty much understand the first 2 columns, which says the supply is none, which to me says you've got no service providers for people with alcohol-related issues. And then the demand is medium, which is above low, just below high. It could be a high medium. So therefore, you have lots of people with alcohol issues and nowhere for them to turn. And therefore, going back to the knock-on effect and the saving of money, the £1.60 investment and all that, why isn't that being addressed? And then can you take me through the other columns on that line, please?
Obviously, that's a conclusion that's been drawn following our planning day and looking at all the other planning that we do over the 12-month period. Yet we've recognised that there has been an increase in demand, but there's no supply or no dedicated supply to alcohol. So what we've done this year, and this is just coming to a conclusion now, is we've piloted an alcohol intervention worker to do a scoping exercise and a piece of research alongside some actual support of individuals to identify what the need is, to really sort of work out exactly what the need is there and the best way of addressing that need and demand. And he's just finalising his report now, and we'll hopefully be using that report to make sure that we're meeting that appropriately, because we recognise there is a gap there. So we've tried to address that with a pilot project.
Can I also add that it doesn't mean to say that persons coming forward with any substance misuse, drugs or alcohol, will not receive a support service. The way that support services are mapped, they have to have a lead need. So they can still receive support from organisations, but it might not be a support service that is specifically dedicated as a lead, call it lead need, around a certain vulnerability. The science behind figuring out the supply, the needs and gaps, moving on to the other areas. I'm not sure which page it is in your papers. 43. Item 39, page 39, is just a flavour of the information that goes into planning services. So the programme is set up on looking at the supply of services there are, looking at what the needs are, and that could include, Welsh Index of Deprivation, it could include things like the housing register, it could include waiting lists for services that are already there, or if there are any voids. It looks at other key strategies, plans, evidence bases, health needs assessments. There's a mapping exercise that's ongoing, so if a member of the public is involved or interacts with either a professional or within a support provider service or through housing options and homelessness team or other social workers, there's a survey that they do with the person they're with that sort of says these are what your needs are, what type of support you need. There's a whole host of information and evidence that is feeds, including consultation with providers and service users, that goes into us as a local area trying to figure out where the biggest needs are. So it could be, if there's a service running where the referral rates are very low, and there's another service with a waiting list of 100 people, well, that sort of tells us something. It doesn't necessarily mean the one service isn't the right one. It might mean that the referral route or the advertising or whatever isn't necessarily what it could be. But all that sort of feeds into the chart on page 43. And I don't know whether members will remember, we used to write big, long, lengthy supporting people operational plans that were like 100 pages, which to people reading it, members of the public, it didn't make much sense. But that sort of showed the depth of information that tried to feed into services. I think most importantly, I think we need to say that we recognise there's a need for services across all the client groups. We recognise that services may be more generic, or they may be very specialised, but there's a need for all of them. And we know that there are gaps. If we could easily spend, I'm sure, the supporting people budget twice over, and there would be enough people to take up the services. So it's a difficult one. So, but any client, we do have generic services, for example, where people can come through. So people have can self-refer into services. We operate a central referral and assessment process or function within Torfaen Voluntary Allowance. It's important to note that people can refer themselves. It's also important to note that all supporting people services in Torfaen are not charged to clients. So they can have a free service. As long as they've got a support need and they're eligible for and they go through an assessment process, the services are free to them, which is not necessarily the case across Wales. So we don't want to exclude people just because they have to pay, for example. Some people pay, some people don't. The services in Torfaen, most people didn't pay anyway. It made sense that we were excluding people who may potentially not need to be excluded.
In regarding, call it your partners, if you like, if you get a referral, for example, to support for support a need in regarding, call it gambling. If like I know that gambling is again one of those addictions which is hidden, if you like, would you tend to signpost on to a more specialised organisation there, or would you tend to deal with it yourself?
Because we commission the services, the referrals go either to the central referral in TVA, or they'll go directly to the provider. So they wouldn't necessarily come to us as officers within the council. But what a good support worker would do, and any support worker would, we haven't got, for example, that's a really good point, we haven't got a specialised gambling support service that links to people's housing needs, because we know it's a need, but the support worker would still be able to support that individual, identifying their goals, and they would link in with any specialised organisations and services that are already in place. And a support worker would know those organisations and projects.
So with that statement there, would you say that none of our residents in Torfaen falls through the net, if you like?
I couldn't say that, because I'm sure there are individuals who fall through the net who probably won't come forward, and I think that's absolutely. If they come forward and they've got a recognisable housing support need, then they'll have a fill-in a form, and they'll be assessed, and then they will receive support, assuming they engage, obviously. Yeah. But no, people will fall, because there will be people who won't come forward.
It's just a sort of statement. In that position, I've known elderly people. They are actually asked, do you want me to help? And they don't really understand what they're being asked. And they say no, so that's it. Well, you've contacted them. You can only offer the service. When it's talked around, sometimes they realise that it is something that will help them, because they're struggling perhaps to get a different house or whatever, and there are people out there. But it's a long process sometimes to get them to understand it's what they need.
Okay. Can you explain the strategic approach that has been adopted to help manage and mitigate the risks associated with vulnerable service users and the reduction in budget?
Obviously, as I mentioned earlier, we've done our best to engage with providers as much as possible, and our colleagues in other services and organisations, to ensure that where we are having to cut projects, that those service users will be picked up somewhere else and receive support somewhere else. And I think at this point, we've done our best to make sure that that's going to happen. Moving forward, obviously the risk increases, because there's only so much that can be absorbed within existing provision. But I think at the moment that's definitely been the way that we've tried to manage things, is to have conversations and look at how support can be delivered differently and more economically.
How do you find the flow of communication then, I mean, locally and sort of wider? Because people move around. There's no borders in the UK, you know, we don't have to move, but people do move around. You get people inherit people's problems, you know. How do you share that well, I know it's confidential data, what have you, but is the communication flow quite rapid and easily accessible for you?
I think certainly from a provider point of view, and I don't know, Helen might sort of feel differently, but a lot of our providers, if you're talking about across Gwent, we do have quite a few providers that operate Gwent-wide, so they would certainly know individuals that are moving through their localities, through their services. Is that? Yeah.
I don't know whether you can add more to it, but I'd like to know, what are the main risks most prevalent to Torfaen's vulnerable service users?
I think that's quite for me, that's a whole host of risks. Probably for me, and this is probably me speaking now, is at the worst end of poverty, social exclusion, is becoming homeless. That to me is the greatest risk, and for somebody to be sleeping rough and potentially to die on the streets and that's across all ages, across all the client groups we've talked about, and that to me is probably the greatest risk, and it shouldn't happen in this day and age, should it? I think the other greatest risk for me is if there's anybody that feels that they can't access support. A lot of us are lucky that we've got family or friends. Sometimes that falls apart, or for whatever reason, to be without support from whomever is wrong. So I don't know how else to answer that one. And the other risk, obviously, from my officer head, budget cuts. Not working properly and working in a co-productive way with all organisations to try and, help people. We're all actually trying to do the same thing and get positive outcomes for ourselves in life and others. Working together co-productively, maturely, having mature conversations, like being able to, talk about budget cuts. I mean, council yesterday, another example of difficult times. So I think there's a risk if we stop doing that type of thing, that actually we're going to take our eye off the ball and we're going to drop it, aren't we? So it's difficult. It's a difficult one. And ultimately with the service users themselves, of course. So if we don't listen to service users, what are we about?
Do you get an awful lot of duplication in regarding the services across Torfaen and duplication?
That's actually something that we have to be quite aware of, because that there is a risk that some individuals may be supported by more than one organisation, and it's actually within our guidance that any SP provider, anybody receiving support funded by supporting people, can only receive it from one provider at a time. Also, what we're very much trying to do, and there's a big push from Welsh Government and the Minister, is to try and link in with other providers of support within Torfaen, like Communities First, Families First, and we are trying to draw those links now and try and establish that, whether are we working with the same families and the same individuals, because obviously we need to make sure we're targeting quite valuable resources now in difficult times, as much as we can, really, to avoid duplication. So we are conscious of that, and I think we are trying to make better links with other organisations to make sure that support isn't duplicated, that it is targeted as much as possible. We are able to pick up quite quickly through the outcomes and QMQ reporting if somebody is receiving support from 2 SP providers, so we're able to sort of make sure that doesn't happen as that often, really.
And what about the third sector agencies? Did you work with the third sector agencies as well?
Yeah, absolutely.
Regarding duplication now?
Yeah, absolutely. And sort of some of the providers that we commission would be third sector providers, so we would be sort of ensuring that, if we're picking up on any duplication there, that we're making sure people are aware of it and that it's not happening and that support is targeted.
Do you find that the Data Protection Act maybe hinders some things, some of the regulations? Would you like to be more freer in sharing information? You could have a customer service record that could be accessed by all these providers if they're signed into it. I know you had, is it Megan's Law, which opened up, and made things a lot better because you can share information across counties and that now. Is that correct?
We use, we recognise service users through a service user reference number. So it's basically the year of birth, first three letters of the surname, and so we wouldn't know whether they're male or female, M or F. So we wouldn't be able to identify those individuals ourselves, but we recognise if that reference number pops up twice, then there's sort of duplication of support there. Yeah.
Want me to go, Chairman? How do you ensure strategic priorities for supporting people programme remain relevant to the people's needs?
I think that comes down very much to our planning process. And as Elka mentioned earlier, we've got quite a sort of strict planning process throughout the year. We engage, we've got our planning day where service users and providers would attend and sort of let us know about what they think is good about services, what they think isn't so good, where the gaps are. All of the data that Elka went through earlier from the LCP, we do have quite a strict framework of planning to make sure that I think that, the needs that we're identifying as strategic as possible, really.
I think through the annual planning, we're always planning and we're always welcoming more information and evidence. But through the annual planning, there have been changes in the types of support needs that people have been having. And I think, for example, one of the things that had been emerging over the last few years was very much the poverty agenda. And welfare reforms, poverty, and we've certainly developed and expanded the financial inclusion service, for example, and that does an enormous amount of homelessness prevention work and work with people and is very specialised around complex financial difficulties that mean people are either going to have their house repossessed or they're going to be evicted. So the services change as time moves on, and that's an ongoing process. Again, there's needs in a whole host of areas. But we try and work with, and the providers that we work with are excellent in terms of flagging up the changing world and different, people's different needs as they come through, and the people themselves. So it's an ongoing process.
Next month, I think the One Benefit system comes in for people on benefit. Are you expecting your work to double or even treble because of this?
Again, very linked to the sort of financial inclusion service that we operate, and the other support providers that also provide support around managing money, etc., not just that one service. Yes, obviously universal credit rolls into Torfaen next month, isn't it? I know we've worked closely with Richard, our head of benefits, and we've got some anticipated figures because it's JSA for new claimants, and we've got an idea of numbers. What we need to do as well, ongoing, is we keep briefing the support providers on the changes in the welfare reforms as they come through, and we've certainly noticed an increase for the reforms that have already come through. We've certainly noticed an increase in support needs linked to sort of benefits. We work very closely with, there's a welfare reform group, which Richard Clark chairs. We are very much linked to that and working with other stakeholders, including Citizens Advice. We had the demonstration pilot project, didn't we, in Torfaen with Bronavon, Charter and obviously Richard in benefits. We're all learning from that. And what that identified was that through the pilot, that people's support needs increased up to 4 times for those who needed support. So yes, we're very much linked to that, and we continue to So in terms of universal credit, I think we've got some understanding of how many we anticipate in the first couple of months, and we need to make sure that those people have access to support services, albeit they need, if they're willing to engage, if they need support. So very much.
Could I just clarify something? In regarding, you said 4 times the amount. Were those support needs hidden, or as a result of, if you like, the universal credit or the pilot?
My understanding would be, because with the pilot, they obviously, through the pilot, a number of tenants went on to direct payments. So whereby the rent, the housing, if they were in receipt of housing benefit and work-related benefits, if the housing benefit previously would have gone straight to the landlord, the person didn't necessarily have to think too much about paying their rent, did they? Obviously, through the pilot, it was recognised that there were a number of vulnerable people who actually would have found it quite difficult to do that. A landlord will provide some element of advice and support around assisting people to pay their rent, but what was recognised that those who needed support previously wouldn't have necessarily needed it because it was going straight to the landlord, but that level of support increased 4 times. So not for everybody on the pilot, but for a sort of certain number, that actually there was a support requirement to help people budget and pay their rent. And then obviously in terms of making sure that they had, appropriate either bank accounts or ways of paying their rent. And, when you get if you're used to having weekly benefits and then a monthly rent or a monthly figure, you need to learn to budget, all of us, isn't it?
And over time, though, did that support the decrease, though?
Again, I wouldn't be fully briefed in terms of, I wouldn't want to detail too much, but there would be some people whose support requirements would have ended, but there will be some people who would have met the triggers and would have needed support more ongoing. And I think that's one of the biggest worries, isn't it, with universal credit? And I know it's only the first phases of the rollout in April, but yes, in time.
Staying on that was quite interesting because I've read a lot on what's going to happen and what has been happening, and with universal credits, yes, you were saying that before it was a case where tenants didn't have to worry about their rent. But I know the government's ethos, from what I understand, is to try and get people to be more responsible, but what they want and what actually happens is 2 different things, and unfortunately the likes of you guys have to pick up the pieces, deal with it. But I know from the landlord's point of view, it's difficult for them because, they're invested in properties, I'm just saying now, to house tenants and what have you, and they're not getting their rent, which discourages them in that line of work. But I do understand that there are schemes set up whereby it's a third party involved that both the landlord and the tenant signs up to in agreement, and they get the money, the third party, and then redistribute everything from there. It's not really solving the problem and what the government's aiming for, but it's actually appeasing both parties, and it is a difficult one to call. But my question is sort of related because it's to do with legislation, and these things can come in, and I don't think this current government is going to stop. There are things going to be coming in if they stay in government on those lines, and there's going to be more difficulties. And my question is, how will you manage demand for housing-related support services at the time of decreasing budgets and the introduction of new legislation like the housing bill, like the welfare reforms? When you get a big piece of legislation that comes in that affects you, how do you manage that? Because, you've got to cascade and disseminate that information as quickly as possible to the service providers, and then, the old cliche, failure to plan is planning to fail, and you've got to deal with this. How do you manage that?
That's a very difficult one, and I think in terms of the Homes Wales Act, I think one of the key pieces of work we've done as a housing authority around trying to prepare for that is where we've worked very closely with our colleagues in Monmouthshire Council, and obviously the Homes Wales Act has 2 key areas that we need to focus on. One is increased responsibilities around homelessness, and rightly so from a human rights perspective. That's good, and our role to actually prevent homelessness and provide people with, solutions. And similarly, the opportunity, I suppose, to be able to house and discharge any duties into the private rented sector. And that's sort of part 1 and part 2 of the Homes Wales Act are really around the private rented sector and licensing private landlords so that we can work with them, I suppose, but also ensuring that as a local authority and as support providers that we're making sure that we provide people with adequate solutions. One of the things we've done that links very much to supporting people is obviously we've joined the 2 Monmouthshire and Torfaen traditional housing options teams into a housing solutions team and a private sector housing team, and that report came to Cabinet, I think it was last February. So that's helping us as a council, and I think in relation to the supporting people services, things like the financial inclusion service and other services that are in the programme are very much geared up around the Act. I mean, there's a whole host of acts. Yeah. I think I'll be honest, I think we still don't fully understand what the implications are for, some external legislation and acts moving forward. But we're certainly, it is about planning, isn't it? And trying to move forward as best as possible. But at the same time, making sure that the services that are in the programme continue to be closely monitored and that are, planned according to changing needs. And the welfare reforms, the Homes Wales Act, we've got the tenancy reforms coming through as another, with the bills and the Act not yet passed. The domestic abuse one, we've got the new generations, we've got Williams. I think all we can do is keep taking those factors into consideration alongside available budgets and working with stakeholders and organisations collaboratively and pooling our resources as much as possible, our skills, our knowledge. And I'm just picking on one example with the housing solutions bit within how Housing Authority, and supporting people have always played a significant role within that, and shaping services, and that's where the strategic planning is crucial, and the tight budget monitoring. And I will say Welsh Government are very, the spend plans, is it quarterly return?
Quarterly outturns.
Yeah, are sent back from the local authority, so they keep a rigid hold on what's going on as well, and I think that actually is good.
Sorry, just to add to that, I think the other thing that we'll sort of continue to do as much as possible, which we're trying to do at the moment and encourage providers to do as well, is promote the service and the benefits and sort of try and kind of, promote the good work that's done through the SP programme to try and minimise the level of cuts that we do get.
You've kind of touched on it there, where you said the last thing that you will be trying to promote it. But bearing in mind that universal credit is probably going to make a big change to the people who are going to be most vulnerable, because they're the ones who have only got such a small amount to budget on in any case. The rent could go by the board, and as you said, homelessness starts the ball rolling and everything's there. What sort of connection is there going to be? I mean, we know it's Bronavon mostly are the landlords in this area, but is there going to be any sort of connection that will trigger that there is a problem building up? How long will it go before their rents, they're really in deep trouble before they picked up?
I think that's something that the housing sector and ourselves in particular are very much pushing for, is the trigger points around vulnerabilities. I think the initial forecasts from central government around the levels of vulnerability were very low. I'm not going to quote the percentage. And what actually the reality is, we realise there's a lot greater amount of people that are vulnerable and are going to have difficulties. And I know our colleagues in Bronavon and Richard and others are very much for trigger points being appropriate and us being able to switch to non-direct payments. I don't know the detail of where we are at that, so I'm not even going to pretend I know there were certain numbers of weeks and etc., but I'm not fully aware of the detail on that at the moment. But absolutely, there's still that. I don't know whether Lyndon might know more actually on this point, but there's still very much a need to understand those vulnerable groups, and we know that there's going to be a lot more people who are vulnerable than was originally anticipated by central government. And I think whether any of the welfare reform and where people switch to and from direct payments, whether there'll be any change moving forward, we'll have to wait and see. But, and that's where what we can do is obviously we can have those conversations with central government or whatever through Department of Work and Pensions and others and registered social landlords such as through the pilot. But in the meantime, we need to make sure that where we can, those support services pick up those people and you know, whether it's through the landlord and trigger points going back out of direct payments, or whether it's support services supporting people to... And there are a number of initiatives, projects and, you know, credit union accounts, those types of things, and other services that are there sort of to help people. It's a difficult one, isn't it? But
thank you. In regarding your discussions with Mr. Davis of the finance, if you like, do you know if there's going to be any catch nets in place for people who fall behind when it comes to their payments, or the wrongly filling in the forms to stop them from becoming homeless?
again, I don't want to speak on behalf of Richard Davis, and because he'll be far more fluent in obviously in where we're at as an area, as a council. One of the other concerns around benefits and claims is some of the online element of people claiming benefits. So there is a lot of work that's been done with the Department of Work and Pensions, and it's sort of on a sub-regional basis, is understanding what services are available and the support services framework to ensure that people have their needs met, whether it could be accessing benefit claims and filling in forms either digitally or whatever. So there's a lot of work, and there is, through the work of the Welfare Reform Group, there are a number of key work streams which focus on making sure all the partners and stakeholders are joined up together to try and work together as best as possible, such as CAB and other provider organisations, including the RSLs. So I haven't really answered your question very well, because I don't really know fully where we're at exactly, and I wouldn't want to preempt anything that our benefits section is doing, but it's certainly very much we're working together. And
I'm quite interested in the collaboration side now, finally, which is, I assume that you have an equivalent in each one of the 22 regions within Wales, and that's where a lot of the funding comes from. How often do you meet with your opposite number, if at all? And I'm sure you do, but, you know, sharing the information, the problems and the solutions, and how does that work?
From a supporting people perspective, across Gwent, we operate the SPROG group, which is the Supporting People Regional Officers group. So that would be the SP leads from all of the authorities in Gwent. We meet very regularly. We have formal meetings quarterly, but we see an awful lot of each other in between that, and we work very, very closely. We also have a SPIN meeting, which is a Supporting People Information Network, which is the national meeting. That happens quarterly as well. National Wales, yeah. And so that's all of the 22 authorities meeting up in Landrindod, Wales, looking at national issues. So yeah, we work very, very closely across Wales, really, but particularly across Gwent. We work together regularly.
The microphone. Yeah, I would like you both to stay if possible, and I'm going to obviously now scrutinise one particular or provider that, you know, and there may be questions still outstanding from this. So if you'd like to, Helen and Lyndon, if you'd like to come down to the table, and we'll get the white light on to you. And
thank you, Chair.
thank you, Elkie. Welcome, Helen and Lyndon. We do have a couple of questions, not too many, and I know you've been present throughout the presentation and the scrutiny from the committee here. And, you know, in your own words, how do you find it? What would you like to add anything to what you've heard today? And, you know, I'm more than happy that it's your own personal opinion or the staff answers. But if you'd like to add anything from what you've heard today, and I don't mind who goes first. If anyone would like to say anything.
I'll kick off, Chair, and thank you for the invite today. I've been quite privileged in working in Torfaen of having to work alongside Elk and the team in a previous role I had, and I know of the planning and preparation that goes into every session that they have in looking at the Supporting People programme, what the priorities are. Within Torfaen now, community safety sits within the portfolio within PSSU. I've read this report carefully, and what I was particularly pleased to see in it is that through the priorities and the commissioning methodology that's being used there, that there's no removal of any of the services wholesale apart from the one service area, and there's no services that's being left without some element of a safety net that sits underneath, which is a great relief to us because, albeit we can't factor or know where crime, disorder and antisocial behaviour is ever going to flare up in any of the areas of this activity, I know through the commissioning strategy that Supporting People have done that there's sufficient capacity in the remaining part of the organisations to support the activities that go on. That gives me some reassurance that there may be an impact, but I don't think it's going to be a significant impact that we won't be able to manage internally. That's both a personal and a service view of how I think the likely impact of these service cuts are going to be. And I suppose the other unfortunate part of this is this is becoming a daily routine for us, working in all sectors of having to manage services where we know that there are significant cuts coming along and consistently significant cuts. So I think the work that's gone into the preparation activity to where we are and the areas that's been suggested that could likely be cut back and reduced are probably the areas that give me some satisfaction, to want a better word, of being able to mitigate any of the risks that may come through, particularly from a community safety point of view.
To add to that? And thank you very much, Lyndon. That was very welcoming news for me anyway to hear your overview, both professionally and personally, that you feel that you know, you're dealing with this on a day-to-day basis. This comes as no surprise. Not quite crisis management as I know it, but you're batting on a sticky wicket day to day. But it's good. It's very welcome that you have full support for the team and the way that their methodology and the way that they're dealing with these cuts. Do you have anything to? Probably best if you introduce yourself. There might be some latecomers to the watching from the outside world, yeah, and they may not know who you are. But
hi, I'm Helen Swain, the Director of Torfaen Women's Aid, and thank you for inviting me today. It's been really interesting listening to the first section of the meeting. I did note down a couple of points that I'd like to make some comments on. And I think it was really just to give a current example of where we talk about you spend £1.60 on the Supporting People programme and it realising savings of about £3.50 in other sections. If you consider, for example, the tragic case of the Buckley family, which I'm sure everybody in the room is aware of, that family, for whatever reason, were not known to Women's Aid Services, either here or Newport, which would be the next closest one. And whilst I'm not suggesting that, not knowing the case fully, that the outcome would have definitely been different. If you imagine if that family had been referred to a voluntary sector organisation, somebody like Women's Aid at some point in the past, what Women's Aid do and what other voluntary sector agencies do is they will only focus on their client and they will back the drum for their client, and in our case that would have been for the female victim and her child. And had we been able to have that input through the Supporting People programme, if she'd been referred to us, if she'd been made known to us, the outcome for that family could have been tremendously different. So yes, we might have spent money on refuge accommodation or rehousing, she may have been moved out of the area, etc. But obviously the cost of that homicide, if you include the police, the murder investigation, the prison and the court, the serious case review itself costs millions of pounds. So that is an extreme example of where spending money on support services can save other sections of the authority's money millions. That's an extreme example, and I wanted to sort of point that out, really. And to mirror what Lyndon said, I think the Supporting People team in Torrine have done a sterling job, really, of managing and negotiating the way through cuts and sort of planning for the future. And they don't just talk the talk in meetings like this, they do walk the walk, and they do communicate with us, they do involve us. We've been very involved in all sorts of formal and informal ways in planning for the future. And they're a great team to work with.
That's excellent. Thank you, Helen. Thanks very much for that. And you made some very pertinent points, which I can relate to, actually, especially when it comes to, well, you can't put a price on a life, and one life taken in a murder case, as it was, is one life too many. But as you said, the investigation and everything surrounding it cost millions. So if they actually did come up with a it's all about this communication, and that's what I was focusing a lot on today. And if you were able to share the information, and it was a failing in communication that led to the death, prevention, but they need legislation, and to concentrate on the legislation and a solution that is forced, that you share this information. I know there'll be aspects of the community up in arms about the do-gooders who Big Brother watching and all that, but as was interestingly pointed out, it's actually 3 letters and a couple of numbers. You don't know even if it's a girl or a boy, but if it flags up twice, across this network, then, it all focuses in, and it can save a life, or maybe a couple of lives, and, I really think that that's what the government, but that's a personal thing, that's me going over and above this professional area that we're in now. Lyndon?
Just to add, because Helen mentioned the Buckley review, we were intrinsically involved in both the serious case review and the domestic homicide review related around the Buckley case. It was an extensive investigation that was undertaken by the statutory agencies, and two reports has been published, both of which are action plans. And just to give the committee some reassurance, information exchange and communication was one of the major recommendations in both reports.
Just got a couple of questions relating to obviously what we're looking at today, and if Councillor Parish.
Right. We'd like to have your opinion. Do you think there are any gaps in service provision which you feel the local authority should be focusing on and prioritising?
I can answer that in a twofold way, if that's okay. I think in terms of gaps within the Supporting People programme around domestic abuse, which is obviously the key thing for me, to be honest, within the remit of supporting people, I think domestic abuse is well covered. Obviously, we have funding, we provide a range of services, and there's other providers, even if they haven't got domestic abuse as a lead need, perhaps it's a Vulnerable Families project, that sort of thing, that they will deal with a lot of domestic abuse issues. And I think within the funding that we have, supporting people have been very reasonable and flexible in terms of working with us to sort of tweak our contracts and negotiate sort of slight changes so that it frees us up to do more with our money. And through that, we've managed to sort of address complex needs better, and we're sort of widening our accommodation portfolio so that we can try and accommodate people regardless of their needs. But I think as a local authority, I think there's other gaps where there is certainly more scope for improvement. And I think the key thing for me is education, because the only way we're going to reduce the demand on services, all the services that supporting people cover, but obviously focusing on domestic abuse from my perspective, the only way to reduce demand in the future is to prevent. And the only way you prevent is through education. And I feel there's some resistance from the Education Authority at the moment about allowing people into schools to talk about healthy relationships. And I think that's because they're worried. It's a big thing. They don't like to open a can of worms. What's the aftermath going to be? Is it their role? There's all these sort of concerns for them, and we are doing our best to try and support education and schools to overcome that by going in and talking to teachers and trying to reassure them that it's better out than in sort of scenario. But we have offered through the sort of schools network free pilots for health relationships work, and we're not getting a lot of uptake of that at the moment, even though we're offering it for free. So I think from a local authority perspective, there could be some more pressure put on the education departments around really sort of embracing healthy relationships and the work that we do with young people. And we're not targeting just schools, we're looking at we've doing some exploratory work with the Youth Offending Service, excluded children, that sort of thing. Anywhere where there's groups of young people where we can get in there and start talking about healthy relationships to sort of set them up for a brighter, happier future, to prevent people becoming perpetrators and to prevent people becoming victims. And I think there's a big gap there in Torfaen, as there are in many other areas where we could be doing a lot more.
It's surprising, really, that the education service isn't taking advantage of the advice you can give, going into schools. There's something we can flag up from this committee. I'm sure we can do that. But it does surprise me that you've had, this resistance to, advising these youngsters. It amazes me.
So thank you. Oh, do you want to come back, Sean? Sorry. That's fine. Obviously, you provide a valuable service, if like, with no awful lot of knowledge and experience. What partnership meetings, stroke forums do you actually feed into, and do you think that you are listened? And the flip side of that, do you think that you should be part of some forums in which you're not members of?
We do manage to be involved with lots of forums, so I think we do have strategic influence. Probably the sort of the highest level forum we're involved with is the Violence Against Women Strategic Board, which used to be the Gwent Domestic Abuse Forum, and that filters down through a whole range of subgroups that we attend, things like the DAC steering group, we attend MARAC meetings, that sort of thing. And then within the sporting people world, we're involved sort of at the Gwent provider level, which is perhaps a little bit informal, all the way through to committees connected to the regional collaborative committees, which SP talked about, and occasionally sort of more national sort of focus groups and things. So yes, we do manage to engage through forums and attempt to have strategic influence and feedback our knowledge and learning, yes.
And the second part was, are you missing any, as in forums?
I'm not aware of any that I'd like to be going to that we're not. Okay.
Thank you, Chair. Just if I could just come back to the question of gaps, really. Having gone through the process that my colleagues in supporting people go through to identify the areas of priority, it's a very extensive exercise. It's very well managed, and from that exercise we get from all the agencies that contribute towards it, we get a list of the key priorities that affect the agencies that provide housing related support. From a community safety standpoint, the areas that are always of a concern to me is the preventing homelessness agenda, which has key impacts across quite a range of different areas that have then anecdotal impacts then on other areas of activity that we're trying to prevent crime and antisocial behaviour. There's an excellent move-on scheme that helps young people moving on into supported accommodation. Again, with Helen, with domestic abuse, it's all very much linked into the key areas that would give me concern from crime and antisocial behaviour, crime prevention activity, if these services weren't in place that they are. From my perspective, there isn't any. There's always going to be gaps for certain specific, specialised client groups that will arise as and when. But from a generic perspective, I think they've done a sterling job in identifying the general areas of activity that we should be concentrating what is a very limited and will become a more limiting resource on. Secondly, Chair, if I could just pick up the point on education. Again, just referring back to some of the outcomes of the recent reviews that were from the unfortunate homicide down in Cwmbran. Education and raising education around violence and prevention was very much, again, one of the key recommendations that came out of particularly the domestic homicide review. That action plan is being implemented as we speak, and one of the recommendations that has been taken forward by my colleague in education, Darren Joseph, who is looking at how we better manage the education of our children and young people within schools in Torfaen. So there is activity going on, but I fully understand where Helen's raising the point as well. But just to give you some sort of reassurance, really, that our education department isn't neglecting that part of the activity. And just in terms of, I suppose, the wider partnership arena, and particularly around the local service board, which sits in our arena. The key areas of activity that my colleagues in supporting people are managing and moving forward very much impact upon the outcome indicators that sit within that higher strategic plan. So from a strategic planning perspective, there's those intrinsic links between what the local authority is managing from a local service board perspective and those high-level outcomes, through then to how those outcomes are being delivered operationally on the ground. And without the Supporting People programme, we would be struggling with some of those elements to be able to implement. So again, there is those, just to give you some reassurance, those high-level strategic outcomes are very much linked into or my colleagues link their strategic outcomes in relation to the higher-level partnership and the wider partnership outcomes that we have at local service board level. Thank you.
I'm interested in the school side of it, and there's the child abuse, and the schools are in quite a privileged and unique position because they actually get custody of the child or wherever for quite an extended period of time of the day, and sometimes that's an area where things are picked up, I'm sure. Is there good communication with the schools, and are they well trained, and is there good liaison with them on recognising things that even for the domestic violence side of it, I'm sure. Is there good good training, and are they well informed to pick up on these things?
There's various. There's obviously the boards that are in place around linking with education, with joint members across the council and others. I was also thinking about, depending on what age, educating children and young people around healthy relationships. It's recognising that the school curriculum and I can't remember, is it PSE, lessons. I'm not sure what age in particular it's good to actually, and I think there's almost like there's a split, isn't there, around healthy relationships. At what age do you actually start to talk to children around what a healthy relationship is? And I think it's recognising that for education they do get asked to have lessons, PSE lessons used to do certain types of non-curriculum type of education, and I wonder where. I know we work with education closely around sort of housing and homelessness, and we've sometimes, it's recognising that they're asked a lot about different things. So I agree. I think unlocking that would be beneficial. But I was wondering what sort of ages it is good to actually to go in and work with children and young people.
There's different ways of approaching different age groups. So at the moment we're trying to pilot 14 plus way of talking about healthy relationships, and it's a national programme. It's endorsed by Welsh Women's Aid. You know, it's a really good quality training package. There's a different way of approaching the sort of 11 to 14-year-olds, and then there's a different way of approaching much younger children. But really, it's getting across to people that we don't go in there and start talking about domestic abuse. It's about healthy relationships, which supports the child to understand different ways of having healthy relationship with peers, with parents, with teachers, and recognising positivity and negativity within those relationships. And if something is negative, not working for them or is upsetting them, then what to do about it and where to go for help and support. So it does sort of fit in with a general sort of approach to sort of PSE type studies, as opposed to picking on a certain topic. But what you'll find, and I think this is what the teachers are worried about, is that for the children that do have domestic abuse in their home, it will trigger a reaction, and what do they do with that afterwards? And I think that's the barrier we have to get across to them, is that there are places to go for support, and it's an understandable situation, because if the child is becoming more knowledgeable about what's right and wrong, but mum or dad, if it's a male victim, aren't, what does that child do with that? But I think we have, it's a very long-term, we hope that the outcomes are long-term, in that we can, where there's an increase in healthy relationships teaching, we would like to think that in 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years' time, there's less young people accessing domestic abuse services. Our refuges at the moment are primarily filled with pretty young women. Whereas 10, 15 years ago, it probably would have been women in their 30s or 40s or even older. We're now looking at 18, 19, 22-year-olds, and primarily in our single women's refuge, which is where we try and sort of support women with complex needs that perhaps haven't got children, or that haven't got children living with them. It's a much younger client group, and that is telling us something. That is telling us that teenagers are very accepting of violence and abuse within relationships, and that's what we need to focus on.
Forgive my ignorance on this, but picking up on that point, I mean, in my age group, I'm 52, I know I don't look it, but I'm 52, but it was unheard of when I left school to have your own accommodation at, say, 16, 17, 18. You were still living with your parents. You never got your own accommodation until you got some job underneath you, and you earn money and you were able to afford to leave home. Now they can demand it in a sort of social environment, and they're living as single mums much, much younger. Is that a factor in the increase of younger?
Yes, my perspective, and this is kind of a personal view really, and it's not necessarily supported by any research I can put my finger on, but what we're finding now is that the young women accessing refuge with or without children, who are perhaps 20, 21, perhaps, it's not just them and their peer group that have complex needs, it's their parents that have had complex needs. And I think, 15, 20 years ago, if you had somebody accessing mental health service, they may have been coming from a background where they had quite a supportive family, who had quite a stable upbringing, but were nevertheless finding themselves in hard times. I think now we're dealing with second and third generation families of complex needs, so that the young women that we see, they haven't got that support background, that family to fall back on, whereas perhaps 20 years ago they would have. And certainly I know lots of people who work in the care sector, and they're finding now, see the 50, 55-year-olds going into care, they're not just people getting older, they're people who've lived a life of complexity in terms of mental health, alcohol and drugs, possibly offending. And that's a client group that they're not used to seeing in the care sector. And I think it's part of society's challenge at the moment.
Obviously, I've got the cutters and the cutties together here in one room. Are you... You've got a chance now to say, because we are actually scrutinising the cuts and were they done correct. I'm sure you're aware of that. And do you feel that the local authority, their approach to the cutting, and they haven't done the salami approach, with the consultation? I'm enlightened by all that, but do you feel that there's anything that they've missed, or do you feel now that the impact on your service is manageable and is fair, given what they've been told to cut 5.45 or £200,000? It's been fairly shared, and the impact you're able to cope with, there's no loss of provision. That's where I would like to hear from you, if you feel that these cuts are manageable.
I think this year Torfaen finds itself in a manageable place. For us as an organisation, we're very lucky for the forthcoming year that we don't have any supporting people cuts, and as we were able to evidence the value of our pilot, which was around supporting women with complex needs, and by that I mean domestic abuse, mental health and or drug and alcohol problems, because we're able to retain our pilot, we, in a sense, we're having a bit more money this year, so we're in a lucky position. That said, with a bit of a caveat on that, I think it's important to recognise that as a charity we do spend every single penny of our income, which isn't just the Supporting People programme, but it does account for about 50% of our funding. We spend every single penny and the demand is rocketing. So whilst it's brilliant, we're not having any cuts. It is stretching our resources because we haven't had an increase for year on year now. That does have an impact on our staff because they're busier, we're expecting more from them, they're a little bit more stressed, their caseloads aren't as stable as they used to be, they're handling sort of higher levels of cases and they're more complex. And I, obviously, as the director, one of my big priorities is to look after my workforce and obviously sort of mitigating that stress and the vicarious trauma that my staff can have by talking to people about domestic abuse and sexual violence all day is a big priority for me. So we do spend every penny and demand is going up. And what obviously I don't want to see is the quality of our service reducing. And I think for the following few years, where cuts might be at my door, then obviously it's going to be very difficult to meet our current contractual obligations on less money. And I think where we had planned last year and this year, if we were to be cut, how we might deal with that, the decision that myself and my Board of Trustees took, the only way we could do that would be to look at salary levels, because we can't actually afford to lose a whole person. And reducing everybody's salary by perhaps £800–900 a year would be not so traumatic as losing a whole staff member. And I think to answer your wider question, I think they've done a really sterling job in difficult times. And I understand from talking to the Supporting People team and from being part of the planning group as a provider rep, the way they've done it is sort of using service reviews to cut funders that weren't delivering a high level of housing related support, and also then to look at the value of the pilots that are in place. And I think, everybody sounds like they agree that it's easier to stomach the loss of a pilot that had an end date than actually start to cut core services. So I think that's been a win-win situation for most people, even the people that have lost those pilots. And I think, like I said, Supporting People, they're not bound by sort of, you know, the criteria, the supporting people framework, that sort of thing, but they do try and be flexible and support us to work in different ways to try and meet needs better, and that's, that goes a long way. Did I answer your question?
You did, yes. Very well. Sorry, this is the point. This is the point in the actual scrutiny committee that we actually need to remind ourselves what we're actually scrutinising, which I will do now. And this is from the report that was written very well, a comprehensive report provided by Elke and Bethan. We were asked today to review, this is the first point, to review the Torfaen Council SP Local Commissioning Plan for 2015-16, which was provided separately as an appendix. Secondly, we were asked to scrutinise the Council's approach to managing and administrating the Supporting People Programme Grant, the SPPG, the budget reductions in Torfaen. And thirdly, we were asked to determine whether an appropriate methodology is in place to mitigate any potential impact on vulnerable service users across the county as a result of a reduction in the grant funding. And before I ask members to comment, I really would like to thank the comprehensive report that has been provided with us today. I was really enlightened. My learning curve has been on a steep rise. It is an emotive subject, and with the cuts, they're inevitable. We know they're happening. Whether we agree or disagree, you have to take that emotion aside, and we are to scrutinise today the report and whether or not Torfaen Council are being fair, being consistent, and have done it with a good structure, good framework, good methodology. I'll reserve my comments for now, but I also would like to thank the invitees that came today, Lyndon and Helen, for giving their perspective on being the end of the cuts. You are actually affected by these cuts, and I was really encouraged to hear what you guys had to say today. For Norma, I'd like to, if you'd like to comment. Do you have anything to add?
Don't think I've got anything to add at this stage. Yeah.
Okay, well, we really, on behalf of the committee, thank you for coming today. It's for us now to actually look at what has been said, to discuss what's been said, but I really appreciate you coming, and it has been very enlightening. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Just round the table now, and if members of the committee, this is the opportunity for us to come up with our recommendations, having obviously looked at what we were heard today, the 3 points, and how you felt. I'd be interested to hear, Norma, if you want to start.
Well, I think the local commissioning plan, as we heard Lyndon say, he's really supportive of it, and they've put a great deal of work into the methodology, you know, to deal with what they've had to deal with, and they have come up with the right answers as far as I'm concerned. I can't really find fault with them. Don't know whether other members feel the same as that, but they've done an extremely good job. I don't think there'll be any significant impact because of this cut, because of the way they've worked their mythology, and well, I think they've mitigated the risks. So I'm satisfied, Chairman, with what I've heard today.
Yeah, thank you very much for that, Norman. Pam?
Yeah, well, just the same, really. I think they're well aware of where the pitfalls could come with benefits changes and things like that. And I think the way they're approaching it, they couldn't have done anything else, really. I mean, the cuts are there, but they are dealing with it. They're not carping about it. They're getting on with it.
Yeah, for me, it proves the importance of scrutiny and the importance of having officers here to actually answer the questions, because, if you like, there was, in the region about 20 questions which were posed, if you like, and that was as a result of reading the document. But having spoken to the officers, if you like, I believe it is a very robust, if you like, documents which have been presented, if you like, and I would commend, if you like, the officers who's also written the report, and indeed for the panel, and that's the key thing as well, is a panel of authorities who have come together to, if I to produce this document, and I think it's very, very robust, and I'm reassured at the end of the day that everything is being done correctly.
One thing, the universal credit is coming in next month, and they know they are going to come up against difficulties, or the people they help are going to come up against difficulties. I mean, we can't say at this point, you know, what effect that'll have, but I think we should be mindful that their workload could increase a great deal because of the changes in the benefit system that's about to arrive next month.
There's nothing I can really add to what you've said as a committee. I accept everything you've said. With the universal credit, I totally agree, but forewarned is forearmed, and I'm really satisfied that for anything that's thrown at them, we've got a very steady team at the helm that will be able to cope with it. They're coping with these cuts extremely well. The report was comprehensive, difficult and emotive subject, as I've already said, and you know, I just there's nothing to add. I'm really, really enthused that they're in charge of this, and they're dealing with it on a day-to-day basis, and everything's in place to cope with anything that's thrown at them, be it legislation or anything in the future cuts. I don't think there's anything other than...
If there is one point, I think we've got to possibly monitor, and that's the knock-on effect when it comes to the other service providers. The fact that, correlate, we don't necessarily see the cuts directly because it's passed on, if you like, to the user groups, and in turn they might have to make people redundant, etc., as a result of those cuts, if you like. So I don't know if that can be worded in a way, or whether indeed it's part of our remit or not.
No, thank you for that, Councillor Kemp, and I really appreciate the line of question, the probing and the depth of the probing, and equally the answers that came back, and I'm sure you're all in agreement that it was very well addressed today. I feel confident. I have got my warm fuzzy feeling back, and I can sleep at night that they're in good hands. And it's... Yeah, I'd like, if Leanne, you could sum up.
Right, just quickly, there's 2 recommendations at the moment which I've picked up from your debate. Recommendation number 1, committee members reviewed the Supporting People Local Commissioning Plan for 15-16 and commended the Supporting People team on managing and administrating cuts in the Supporting People grant. So that's the first one. Recommendation number 2, members also agreed that appropriate methodology has been used and considered to mitigate the risks and to reduce any potential impact that the budget cuts would have on vulnerable service users. The only other point I sort of picked up from your questioning with the invitees was the point that Helen Swain raised about how she was finding it difficult to get sort of access into our schools.
Yes.
I don't know whether that's a question you would like to pose to the executive member on why there has been no take-up on holding healthy relationship workshops in our schools, and whether that could be an avenue that could be explored in the future.
Could we put it in perhaps that we are disappointed?
Yeah.
That we are disappointed to hear that Torfaen Education Department, or whoever is responsible, is not being perhaps as cooperative as we would have hoped.
It's very
And say we can see the benefits of, such a programme to go into school,
Sorry.
especially for the older children, not for the younger ones.
She did say that, didn't she?
Yes.
Raising education as a
14
means of prevention
Yes.
is key.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
I'll try and word that,
Yes.
and of course I'll send it out to you all for approval before I send it to the executive member.
I find it quite a sensitive issue. It is a sensitive issue when you're talking about schools and the teachers becoming involved, because at the end of the day they are public servants and they are paid, they're on the payroll, but to give them that additional training is like having a hidden service provider, and prevention is better than the cure. And at a very, very early age they can spot abuse, bruising, whatever, but some of them are too clammed up and they're not on my watch and what have you, to actually report things. But if they knew how to really recognise the signs, just as doctors are, I think that's an avenue that needs to be explored a little bit more myself, rather than let it get to the age of 12, where maybe they've watched their mum being belted by the dad for the last 10 years and thinks it's normal, If any members have anything else at this stage, the only thing that remains is the date of the next meeting, and that is to note the 29th of April 2015. And invite Leanne now to go through the remaining items in the work programme, so the committee is able to agree on the next item to be scrutinised. And if I could now formally end the meeting. Thank you.